and welcome to the Collegium, our monthly magazine program in 3 parts: cinema, state of affairs, and our arts calendar. I want to talk to you about the 477th Bombardment Group. But before that, I'd like for you to tell us what, in your opinion, were the accomplishments of the 332nd Fighter Group.
Well, first of all, they said we couldn't fly. During the 5 years that Tuskegee Army Airfield was in operation, we graduated almost 1,000, 900 and some pilots with silver wings, all African Americans. 450 of us went overseas to fly combat in Europe in fighter aircraft. We flew in Europe 4 different types of fighter aircraft. The P-39, which was obsolete when the war started. It was such an inferior airplane that the English refused to accept it, but we gave some to the Russians. We also flew the P-40, and we flew that for a year in close support work, dive bombing and strafing the enemy close to our own friendly lines. We flew the P-47 in combat for about a month, but then we got the P-51, and we got that in the spring of 1944 and kept it for the rest of the war. The P-51 was probably the best fighter plane that either side had during World War II. Although they said we couldn't fly, we flew over 15,000 sorties. We escorted bombers on over 200 missions. We had the unique record of never having lost a bomber that we were escorting to enemy fighters. I say unique because we're the only fighter group that could make that statement. We destroyed about 150 aircraft in the air. We destroyed another 250 enemy aircraft on the ground, and any number of large gun positions and trains and convoys and things like that. 2 of our pilots, while they were flying the P-47, which had 8 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, were coming back from a mission up north, well, north of Italy, Austria or someplace, saw a German destroyer in the Adriatic Sea up there and decided that they might as well expend some bullets on it and do some damage. And they went down and they opened fire, and there was a big explosion on the ship, and the ship sank. It's the only time such a feat has been accomplished by airplanes just using machine guns, before or since. Of course, both of them got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that action. We lost 66 pilots killed in combat, and we had 32 shot down, or forced down in enemy territory for one reason or another, and they became prisoners of war.
When we talk about the 477th Bombardment Group, could you tell us a little bit about that, and also the Freeman Field incident?
Well, we were turning out so many pilots at Tuskegee that we had more pilots than we needed, not just for one fighter squadron as people had thought in the beginning, but we had more trained pilots that could be used in a fighter group. So we had 4 squadrons of fighter squadrons, 4 fighter squadrons. We still had extra pilots. So they decided to train some of them in 2-engine airplanes. And they had a training plane, a 2-engine training plane. I think it was a AT-10 or something like that. But then they went into the B-25, which was the medium bomber at that time. And the 477th was equipped with the B-25. And they were stationed at Freeman Field in Seymour, Indiana. They had a crew of 4 or 5. They had 2 pilots, pilot and a co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, an engineer, and a tail gunner, I believe, all African Americans. And of course, their ground support people were all African Americans also, maintaining the airplanes and the supplies and the food and everything else necessary to support a bomb group. And they were trained and ready to go overseas before the war ended, or about the time the war ended. They never got to go overseas. But while they were at Freeman Field, they found that there were places on the base, although they were the predominant unit on the base, there were places on the base that they couldn't go because they were black. And the thing that caused the Freeman Field incident, as it is called, was the fact that the African American officers felt that it was their duty, their right is a better word, to use the officers' club. Army regulations at that time required that all commissioned officers be members of the officers' club. But they found out that when they got to the officers' club that they were barred entrance. And they didn't like that. And they put their heads together and decided that they should do something about it. And they decided that they should not go to the officers' club and try to enter en masse, because then they would be accused of causing a race riot. So they decided to go in groups of twos and threes. And of course, as they approached the door, there were MPs or other officers or something there on the door to turn them away. And they decided that that wasn't working, so they decided to go in anyway. And about 102 of the officers were arrested. They were forced to sign a statement that they understood that they were not to go into the officers club and that they accepted that ruling, but some of them refused to sign. 3 of the officers who had pushed their way into the officers club were arrested and they were put in jail. The other were just confined to the quarters. One was court-martialed, found guilty, and spent 80-some days in jail. The war ended, so he was given a dishonorable discharge and put out of the service. After he got out, he went to law school and finished the law school, only to find out that he couldn't practice law in the United States because he had a felony conviction on his record. About 1995, 50 years after the fact, President Clinton pardoned him and cleaned up his record because he was in his 70s by then and his law career was ruined. He worked in the law field but never as a lawyer, and he still lives in California.
How did this incident or this affair impact upon the United States Armed Forces? What were the results of this incident?
I don't know whatever happened to the base commander at that time who put out the illegal ruling that African Americans couldn't go into the officers club and some other places on the base that were open to whites. Nothing really happened immediately that was obvious to us to improve the situation, except that it was decided about that time that the 332nd, which was back in the States, and the 477th, which was in the States, should be put on a airfield of their own with a black commander and black officers. And this site selected was at Columbus, Ohio, at a place that was then called Lockbourne Air Force Base, and now it's Rickenbacker. And the 2 groups were combined into a composite group, flying B-25s and they had P-47s at that time. Colonel Davis, who was a colonel then, but is a retired 4-star general now, was the base commander. And all the military people there and most of the civilian workers there were African Americans. There were some white civilians there working for civil service who stayed on. They had been working there before and they stayed on in their jobs and didn't leave. Columbus, Ohio, which was close by, didn't relish the idea of this African American base being close to them. But after we'd been there for a while, They recognized the benefits of having a military installation, and they recognized also that we were not going to cause the trouble that they had anticipated we were going to cause. They too had prejudged us.
What was the effect of, I believe it was Harry Truman in 1948? How did his desegregation of the United States military impact upon black troops? And when, in fact, did it take effect? One thing was the law, and another thing was how it really affected the people in the field.
Well, in 1948, the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, or the Army Air Force, U.S. Air Force at that time, had separated from the Army the year before. The Chief of Staff had decided that he was going to integrate the Army Air Corps, regardless of what the other services did. But before he actually had an opportunity to affect that integration, President Truman signed Executive Order number 9981 that integrated the armed forces. Still, many organizations and services dragged their feet on integration. The Air Force, I'm proud to say, led the way in that integration. The Army dragged its feet for a few years. The Army had its last all African American unit fighting in Korea in 1950. The Navy and the Marine Corps followed on 2 or 3 years later before they started integrating. Up until that time, African Americans and Filipino Americans mostly served in the Navy as stewards and waiters and cooks and bakers and other subservient jobs on the ship, but never in higher positions than those. African American units were all service organizations, mostly commanded by whites up until that time. In 1953, I was overseas in the Pacific, and I received an assignment back to McClellan Air Force Base in Sacramento, California, to be the commander of a small outfit of about 100 people. And word got back to that organization that they were going to get a new commander. I was a major at the time, and that the commander was going to be black. And of course, I didn't know that when I got there, but I found out after I got there that as soon as the word got out that they were going to have a black commander, and at that time there were no blacks in the outfit. Some people went to the orderly room and requested transfer. Some of them got transferred out. But I stayed there 4.5 years. While I was there, not one request for transfer came in. And I was told 30 years later by 2 people, officers who had retired as full colonels, that I had been the best commander they'd ever had. And one of them told me I replaced the worst commander he'd ever had. It gets back to having been prejudged by things that they had heard about blacks. But when they got to know me personally, they found that our similarities outweighed our differences, and our differences were very small, minimum.
What, in your opinion, is the difference in American society between World War II and, say, today, 2001?
Well, to start with, we haven't gotten to that point where we realize Martin Luther King's dream when men are created or are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We still have a lot of racism in our country. We have a lot of hate crimes in our country, mostly perpetrated against African Americans and other minorities, but mostly African Americans. We have police brutality on African Americans mostly. There are some instances in the recent history in New York City, for instance, where one African American was shot 40 times by 4 policemen, and who say they thought he was reaching for a gun, but he was unarmed. The trial for those 4 policemen moved to Albany, New York, and they were acquitted. There was a case where an African American was arrested and in jail, subdued, under control, and he was sodomized by a broken broomstick and had a lot of internal injuries. I don't know what his condition is. We have instances down in North Carolina at Fort Bragg where a couple of white soldiers went off base to Fayetteville and killed a black couple just because they were black. Come to find out they were a member of a white racist group comprised of soldiers at Fort Bragg, and they probably thought that would enhance their position in the white racist organization. There's a case down in Jasper, Texas, where a young black man was dragged behind a pickup truck until his body came to pieces for no reason other than he was black. But discrimination isn't visited just because of skin color. Sometimes it's because of religion. Like down in Southern California, where a white man who was a member of that organization up in Idaho, the Aryan Nations, with an assault rifle, opened fire at a Jewish community center and wounded 5 people, and then went out and killed a Filipino American who was carrying the mail because he wasn't, let's say, white and Christian. And let it be known when he was apprehended, there was open season on people who weren't like him, white and Christian. There are other instances like that, but it also is visited on people because of their gender. We had a soldier at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, who was beaten with a baseball bat. He was a white soldier who was homosexual, I suppose, and a white soldier killed him because he was a homosexual. That's white killing white, because of his gender. And there was a case up in Laramie, Wyoming, where a white college student up there who was a homosexual was killed by 3 white people, beat up and left for dead. And he actually did die 3 days later because he was a homosexual. So we got a long way to go in our country yet, although things are a lot better now. We don't have segregated schools and water fountains and restaurants and even hotels. Back then, when we traveled on the road in an automobile, we couldn't stop at restaurants and eat. There were some restaurants that would pass food out the back door or the back window, but most of them wouldn't service. There were hotels, very few, not any in the South that we could stop at, and even in New York City, and Chicago, and Detroit, and Las Vegas, there were hotels that we couldn't stay in. I found out not too long ago that Frank Sinatra broke the barrier in Las Vegas. He was with his Rat Pack. The Rat Pack was Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, Sammy Davis Jr., I think Peter Lawford, I don't know who else, maybe another one or 2 that I forgot. But they went to a big hotel down there because they had contracted to do shows there. And the management told Frank that Sammy Davis could perform, but he couldn't stay in the hotel.
And Frank Sinatra told the manager, "No Sammy, no show." And it took the manager about a half a second to recognize the color of money rather than the color of the skin. And that broke the barrier in Las Vegas. Also, during World War II, Lena Horne was under contract to the USO to go around the country entertaining black troops. And she went out on the stage at Fort Riley, Kansas one evening to do her thing, and noticed that right down in the front row, German prisoners of war were sitting there, and way in the back of the theater were the black troops. So she didn't like that situation and walked off the stage and didn't perform at all. And the next morning she called the USO and reported the incident. So they canceled her contract, and for the rest of the war she went around the country at her own expense entertaining black troops. I've heard many stories from servicemen, African-American servicemen who served back in those times, that indicated that German prisoners of war in many instances were treated as guests in our country. And they certainly were treated better than African-American tax-paying, law-abiding citizens in our country. And these German prisoners of war were the people who were killing our people. And mostly they were killing our white people, because the combat units mostly were white. We had very few combat units. There was the 92nd Infantry Division that saw the combat down in Italy, in the 442nd. I think it was made up of Japanese Americans that fought down in Italy also. But by and large, most of the people being killed during the war by the Germans were white. Yet they were being treated as guests in our country and better than African American citizens who were law-abiding, tax-paying, loyal Americans.
When you tell us that history, does that double standard still exist in the United States, in society, and in the military? And where is the United States going in the future, in your opinion?
Well, to get to the last part of that, I don't know where the United States is going. I can only hope that things are going to improve. I think they're still bad. We very often read in the paper about racial profiling, where African Americans or anybody with darker skin, particularly if they're driving a nice automobile, a late model car, are stopped only because they are driving a nice car and they have color in their skin. Police brutality is on African Americans more so than others too. There is still a reluctance to hire African Americans in some jobs, in business, in commerce. It's just that it isn't so overt as it used to be. But there is still a lot of racism in our country, and not just because of race, but sometimes because of gender also. People thought that women couldn't do a lot of things that they can do. For some reason, the men in power, in high places, I think they like to think that they could do things that women couldn't do. But women, there are more women doctors now and women dentists, which we didn't see back in the 30s and 40s. We've got women flying military aircraft now. And they thought that couldn't be done either, but during World War II, there were a lot of women who were ferrying military aircraft all around the country, and some of them flew more types of airplanes than I did, and I flew over 15. Recently, we have had a woman commander on our space shuttle. We have had women in space as astronauts. About 2.5 years ago, maybe 3, I was down at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, where there were 5 African Americans astronauts in training. 3 of them were women. One had an electrical engineering PhD, and the other 2 had PhDs in aeronautical engineering. And yes, they expected to fly. Because we've had one African American woman in space already, and a few African American men in space. They said we had no qualities of leadership, but I know of 7 African Americans who have reached 4-star rank, which is high as they can go in the armed forces. we're getting more and more African Americans into appointed and elected office in our governments. We've had one African American governor. We have many members of the House of Representatives and many members of Congress who are a minority group. And that is something that we didn't have back during the 30s and 40s and 50s. We're making progress. There's nothing quite as slow as social change. But the armed forces of the United States is in the forefront, forging ahead with its social integration in the armed forces.
Last question, could you tell us a little bit about your family? And you told me a little bit earlier about your sons.
Yeah. I'm widowed. I was married for 54 years. I've been with it for about 5 years now. I have 3 sons. The oldest one was in the United States Air Force as a pilot. He is now a captain on the A320 Airbus for United Airlines. One is a criminal defense lawyer living in Richmond, Virginia with his own firm. And the other one is truthfully between jobs. He was a district sales manager for Eastman Kodak Company, and a part of the company that he was in downsized, and he asked to be downsized. So now he says he's on temporary retirement, but actually he's between jobs. I have 4 grandchildren, all in their 20s now. The oldest boy, my grandson, is 33, just last Wednesday. And I have 2 great-grandchildren. My oldest granddaughter, will be 23 in August, just finished Spelman College in Atlanta last May, magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. And she's now in her first year of medical school at Wake Forest Medical Center.
Colonel, thank you very much for joining us here on the Collegium, and best wishes to you.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Collegium, our monthly magazine program in 3 parts. Tonight we're very pleased to bring you an interview with Colonel Howard Baugh, who is a member of the Tuskegee Airmen. Tonight you will have the opportunity to hear the history, the past, the present, and what we hope for will be a lengthy future of the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen have a distinguished history. They were some of the forerunners to break many of the barriers, or certainly some of the barriers, that existed in the United States of America during World War II. Those unfortunate barriers were overcome by some of the men that you will hear about and the man that is here tonight. Shall I continue to go?
Yeah. Because I just see the light when you make a close-up.
One of the interesting issues that perhaps we will hear tonight is what are the differences between what happened in the social era of 1945, 2000. Okay, we got it? Yeah,
Yes.
Oh, you want me to say something too, huh? Okay. Understand that you must be bilingual, and you speak English very well. Of course, as far as I know, it might be your first language.
Oh.
Is that coming through okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Compliments always work.
Your compliments are never miss.
Compliment will get it every time.
Yeah.